Great. Um, so I was raised in the Diocese of Southern Ohio. So this is my home diocese. I actually grew up at the cathedral, where I know some of you know Rob Rhodes was there for several years. So when I was young, though, it wasn't the cathedral, it was just Christ Church, and became the cathedral later, like kind of post-graduation from high school. And but so that was the church that I grew up in, and I went off to college. I went to Mount Holyoke College in Western Massachusetts, all women's college there. And after that, really just wanted to move to be with friends in Boston. So I ended up working, the dean of the cathedral at that point, Jim Leo of our cathedral here in Cincinnati, was a good family friend, and he had been previously the dean of the cathedral in Paris for 12 years. So he, as you know, the church is about all of our connections. He introduced me to a priest in Boston who was at that point the priest at the Church of the Advent in Boston, which high Anglo-Catholic church. Some of you might be familiar with it. They had gone through.
That's that.
I'm sorry.
Who was the priest?
Alan Warren, Father Warren, Alan Warren. And he's actually still there, I think. But he was looking for someone to come do youth and young adult kinds of things, children's ministry. And so I think I said yes to that job more because I just wanted to live in Boston than I really knew what I was getting myself into. But I went and worked at Church of the Advent for about a year. And while I was there, began to experience a call to the priesthood. And while it was clear that they weren't super supportive of women's ordination, but Father Warren was a great guide and friend and mentor during that time. And so I left Church of the Advent and came back to Southern Ohio. I was a Montessori teacher for a couple of years while I was doing discernment. And then went back to seminary, went back to Boston. I went to Episcopal Divinity School. And post EDS, I came back to Southern Ohio. I was in Dayton for 5 years, which if you know anything about Dayton, Ohio, it's a lot like Detroit, kind of on a mini scale of a lot of poverty and decline that happened in that area after the car industry kind of died in Dayton. And so I worked in inner city church on a part of Dayton that was primarily African American, but it was a very integrated church, a beautiful church, and was the priest there for about 5 years. While that was going on, my husband was the director of youth ministries and camping for our diocese. So I did a lot of work with young adults as well. And so I was talking to a lot of young adults about how they weren't finding a place in the church. And we're talking about young adults who'd grown up in the church, who became camp counselors, who went on to attend church regularly. And they were telling me, sitting in our living room, telling us stories of how the church just wasn't welcoming to them and they weren't able to find a home in the churches that they were visiting. So I had that on my heart. And simultaneous to that, I met a group of Rwandan and Burundian refugees who were living in Dayton, some of whom had moved there since the genocide in Rwanda around 94, some who were newer immigrants to this country. And I began talking with them. They were telling me stories of surviving the war, surviving the genocide there. And they started coming to church. They started bringing friends to church. And after a while, they said, "We love you. We love this church, but we miss singing songs in our own language." And I said, "Oh, of course, of course." And so we tried to have them sing some of the songs that they knew from home in church, but it always kind of felt like a performance, one group performing for another group. And so after a while, we talked again, and they said, "Well, what if we started a prayer fellowship gathering?" And I said, "Oh, well, I have no idea what that is, but if you teach me, we can start one." And so they started this prayer fellowship gathering that was meeting on Saturday evenings. And very quickly, we had 50 or 60 people who were coming. It was all in Kinyarwanda, which is the native language of Rwanda. And they made music and prayed and offered witness to the ways God was working in their lives. They called themselves New Hope because they had found new hope here in the United States. And so as I was working with them and working with these young adults, I think God really placed on my heart the sense that I had always felt called to kind of urban ministry and to people on the margins. I'd done some work with the homeless while I was in seminary. And I felt really clearly that God was saying, there are a lot of people who are on the margins of the church today, and how are we going to connect with them? And all the kind of creative and lovely things that we did at St. Andrews, where I was, weren't really drawing new people except these Rwandans. And I said to myself, okay, so what if we are willing to start where they are and build church the opposite direction? Instead of trying to get our church to grow, what if we'd start a new church, essentially? And I went to our bishop and our canon to the ordinary with this proposal. I think in my mind, I was really pitching a church plant, not just for Rwandans, but I think specifically for young adults, for people who just didn't fit into church. The bishop basically said, well, instead of starting one church, what if we start lots of communities? And what if you were to serve as our diocesan missioner working on this? And so I did. And I think at the time I started, it was about 6 years ago, I was one of a kind of handful of missioners on diocesan staffs at that time. I remember looking around the country for colleagues and not finding very many. Since then, a lot of bishops have now hired missioners on their staff. And at one point we had 3 different missioners on our diocesan staff as well, 3 or 4 actually. And so that's become one of the kind of centerpieces of my Bishop Reinfeld's staff. So what happened after that? So essentially, I think I had in my head that in 6 months, I could raise up 10 teams. We would send these teams out and they would start new communities around the diocese, and it would be really great. People from churches would send their members out to do this. And so, of course, I started going around talking to people in churches and doing preaching in adult forums and meeting with groups, and all of these people just looked at me like I had 3 heads. Like, you mean you want us to send our people out to go do something that is not directly going to benefit our church? And I said, yes, it'll be so great. The church will grow. And they said no and patted me on the back and said, good luck. And so I had to kind of start my plan over again. And it really started initially with a lot of people who weren't Episcopalian. I started meeting with people from other denominations, some people who were kind of walking out of the vineyard, some people who were formerly Methodist or something else, who just charismatic, who just weren't satisfied with their church homes, and just began talking with them. And what I found was that they found a lot to love in the Episcopal Church, but probably wouldn't have entered through the red doors on their own. So I did a lot of like one-on-ones. For a while, we started a kind of house church community in my neighborhood. We met for about 1.5 years, and we did some kind of public worship services as well, kind of experimenting with new forms of worship. And what came out of that is almost all the people who were part of that either entered ordination process or found their way into existing parishes. You know, they ended up having kids or families and wanting Sunday school and things like that. And so, you know, at one point I was like, am I failing? Like, am I failing my plan of raising up these new missional communities as people are finding their way back into the church the opposite direction, and possibly into leadership? But it seemed like that was one of the ways that God was working in those early years. And then the other thing that happened was I just started talking. We had a lot of intentional communities in our diocese. So we had 2 groups who had kind of early on formed intentional communities prior to my being hired on the bishop's staff. And I think the bishop's idea was that I would sort of serve as chaplain to those communities informally, that I spent a lot of time kind of gathering them, offering retreats and meeting with them and speaking about what they needed. And so out of that, we began to start other intentional communities. So we started a young adult intentional community here in Cincinnati that we now call Brendan's Crossing, and it's recently become an ESC, Episcopal Service Corps community. Another Episcopal Service Corps community started in Columbus alongside the existing intentional community that lived there, which was called the Franklinton community. And they had done a whole series of ministries in that neighborhood, everything from gardens to, they started a cycle works, a bike shop for that neighborhood, which didn't have a lot of transportation options. So they have a co-op called Franklinton Cycle Works, and they do a lot of amazing ministry there. But so we started a whole series of different intentional communities. One of them is now called Lydia's House. It's a house in the Catholic worker style. So homeless women and children live alongside live-in volunteers. And so I'm on the board of that. We founded that about 4 years ago. They're now moving into the arena of affordable housing, trying to find more housing for the women that have lived in their community. And a farm called Tikkun Farm, the Jewish phrase Tikkun Olam, the healing of the nations. So they're doing a lot of work around healing both the land, their neighborhood, their community, and people and individuals. So I've been working with those kinds of initiatives as well. So we've begun to form what we call praxis communities, which, as I was studying the Fresh Expressions movement coming out of the Church of England, which was kind of at heart the origin of what my bishop and I sort of settled on. At the time, the language of emergent church was really popular. And I grew pretty quickly dissatisfied with the idea of emergent because it felt to me like a real breakaway from the evangelical movement. And the work that which it was, right? Oh. And the work that I wanted to do was less break away from the church that I knew and loved, but, kind of pay attention to where the Holy Spirit was moving. And what I loved about the Fresh Expressions movement in England was there was this real holding to how do we hold both the traditions of the past and these new fresh expressions of church that are emerging? How do we hold them together under the same umbrella, which to me felt very Anglican and just true to my own formation and understanding of what church is and what church should be. So in their ordination vows, for those of you that aren't familiar with the phrase fresh expressions, the priests in the Church of England, their ordination vows, in part, of course, affirming the historic creeds and scriptures, but also to proclaim the gospel afresh in every generation. And so that's how the phrase fresh expressions kind of came into being. So what does it mean to proclaim the gospel afresh in every generation? And so as I was learning from them, I actually met with the bishop who had been overseeing Fresh Expressions in England. And his name at the time he's no longer in that position, but his name is Graham Cray. And he encouraged me when we met that I shouldn't just take their language for Fresh Expressions and import it here, but that we should come up with a name for what we were doing that kind of came organically out of our own communities and our own diocese. And so for us, we spent a long time wrestling with the name and what are we going to be and all that. But that was the idea behind Praxis, and really realizing that for me, as I was working with all of these various communities and young people and immigrants and various expressions of church, that for us, it was really about the practice, that there wasn't one thing that every community would say, this is who we are, and then we'll affirm this thing. But there was a sense that we had some common practices and shared ways of doing ministry. So we talk about communities of faith and practice, and really have reflected and continue to reflect as we gather our leaders on what is praxis and what are the practices that we're living into in the seasons that we're in. And I can say more about that. Some of that's on our website too, but so that's kind of the origin of praxis communities. It's kind of this loose affiliation of groups and individuals. We've done all kinds of experiments of church. We've brought our kind of campus ministries under this umbrella, so that young adult and campus ministries and intentional communities and new worshiping communities kind of have this thread weaving through them, that none of them are alone, these kind of new ways of doing church. And a lot of what I say, my mantra is two things. One, to unleash the imagination of the church, and two, to really kind of ask the question, what is church? And often saying this counts too. Just because we don't have a building, or we, are not worshiping and, in a Eucharistic celebration, this group of people praying together and living together and sharing life together is an expression of the church. And so I think that's been kind of my work, is lifting that up to our diocese and to places beyond our diocese. I've shared this with other diocesan leaders in other dioceses about what we've been working on. But for me, the networking piece of it, where no one's alone in this, has been really helpful. And also the kind of blessing from the church to say, what you're doing matters to us. We want to partner with you. We want to walk alongside you. We want to encourage this missional expression in whatever way we can. And some of it's just showing up and being like, this is important. Great job. Like, we're not giving you money. We're not going to do a whole lot more. We're just sort of giving people permission. And some of it's been heartbreaking. Like, I've had people come up to me and say, do you mean that we could pray like Compline with our neighbors and like have them over for dessert? And that would be okay? And I said, yeah, that is what we mean. And in fact, the origin of our tradition says you should be doing that. Like, you don't need my permission to do that. Yeah. And somewhere along the line, I think people in the Episcopal Church have gotten the message that if there's not a priest there and there's not, someone from the church who started it, that they don't have permission to like count. Yeah. And that's been really hard for, I mean, I really did go into this thinking that people like wanted to engage this, and I realized how much they really feel that they're not even allowed to. Right. So some of the work has just been like getting the word out there that like, yeah, you can do this. This is your baptismal vows give you permission. You don't have to be licensed to share the good news with people and to seek and serve Christ and all people. Like, you can go do that. You can create new ways of doing that in the world.
No, I think that's I come from an evangelical background, and that's always been my take on the Episcopal Church. Even in the old low church days, and I know that you're in historically low church diocese. Now I think things are probably quite different. That was always my sense, that people didn't think they had the permission to do this. Mm. So that's encouraging.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's been a big piece of it, is just trying to explain to people like there's a path, and we've done different things. We've offered like a school of mission and tried to train people and give them tools. But again and again, I keep coming back to a lot of this work has just been walking alongside people. I like the word apprenticing, although I know some people don't like that word, but the sense that we're not, pouring information into people, but we're inviting them to co-create with us and say, hey, you want to plan something? I'll help you. So a lot of our things came out of that. Like we did a whole series of flash complines where we would do kind of pop-up compline in various neighborhoods and inviting leaders to help lead those and say, you can lead the worship. You can help us plan where we're going to do it. And we can all meet for coffee or a drink afterwards and talk about it. So things like that have been part of the ways that, for me, Flash Compline isn't the end product, but it's the teaching tool to give people little experiences of what does it feel like to do liturgy in public? What does it feel like to not have this be your own private group of friends? Like, what does it feel like to just try on something and see what happens?
It sounds like a lot of the work, if I'm hearing this, is that there's a pattern here, right, of engagement in a variety of different ways, sharing stories, experimentation, and mixed results.
Yep.
And all of this is with this there's an affiliation, but it's loose, among the various things. So it sounds like there's a lot happening at once.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you have to have, I often joke that my biggest skill set is I have a high threshold for chaos, right. Which very few Episcopal priests that I know do, but like you have to like actually be willing to just be like, I don't know what's going on here. I'm not actually in charge. I'm kind of along for the ride as much as anyone. But yeah, the other thing for me is I'm convinced that in this world that we're in right now, that the future of the church lies more in networks than it does in hierarchy. Right. And so it really is saying that the network itself is the nature of our relationship to each other. It is not because I'm in charge and these people do what I say. Yeah. It really is me saying, I'm in relationship with you. So the way that the Church of England talks about this is they say high accountability, low control. And the accountability sometimes throws us because when we think of accountability, we think of like hierarchical relationships. Who do I report to? But for them, accountability is really relational accountability. I know you, I care about you, so I'm going to tell you what's happening in my community because we're in a relationship with each other. We're accountable to each other in the same way a friendship or a marriage might be accountable. And not because one person's in charge, but because we know each other and we're going to be in that level of relationship. But I'm not going to try and tell you what to do. I'm going to trust that you on the ground know what's best for your community more than I do. So that's another piece, I think, of the work, is that like high accountability, relational accountability with people.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this, is it like, it almost sounds like all the ministries of the diocese are part of Praxis. You know, whether a church has a CDC, you know, as a homeless shelter, or helping you know, single at-risk mothers, or intentional communities. They do, in fact, feel of a piece.
Yeah, I think what's been fun.
How do you do that? I mean,
yeah, I think what's been fun is that, like I said, in the beginning, I kind of felt this like level of rejection from the church when I first started serving as missioner. Like,
welcome
we don't know
to the club.
What'd you say?
Said, welcome to the club.
Right. Yes, exactly.
I ran a parachurch, interfaith and ecumenical parachurch educational organization for 32 years. And finally, sort of got blended into the diocese, but the beginning was very difficult.
Right. And I look back on that as being like really painful. I remember a lot of my conversations with my bishop were like, I just feel like everyone hates me. Like, I don't understand why everyone's so against this idea. I thought they'd be excited. But it felt a lot like a parachurch in the beginning, the kind of modalities and sodalities that people used to talk about. But I think that what ended up happening, to your point, Larry, is that once we started gathering people, and in fact, evangelicals and vineyard people ended up being the best missioners. Like, they were actually willing to go do this work.
Yeah, of course.
And I was sort of bringing this liturgical sensibility alongside that, but like they were fearless. And I think most Episcopalians have so much fear about this, and just being people of faith in the world. And so like, I think what happened though was that once they started seeing our communities like offering things and networking and getting together, I started getting invitations from people. So like, one of our churches here in Cincinnati has a ministry called the Open Door, and it's like a not-for-profit service to the homeless and people with kind of mental disabilities. And, you know, their director calls me and says, you know, so many people in the city and so many people in not-for-profit world and in the church. Can you come help us think about how to be networking with you and how to connect, you know, young adults and people who want to do service and, you know, other not-for-profits in the city. And so then I'm coming alongside, and they're basically asking to be invited into our network, sort of. And again, the network's so loose that there's not like really like you're in or you're out. It's like, do you want to come to something? Or, you know, do we know each other? Do we become relationally connected? But so one of our young adults who lived in our intentional communities and has been part of our praxis communities ended up going to work at that community after he got ordained. And so he's like the connecting point, right? Like, this level of relationship, all of a sudden Open Door wants to be part of our network. So yes, to your answer, Larry, but it didn't start with the churches wanting to connect with us that way. It really started with these kind of weird people out here who no one knew what to do with.
Individual parishes feel part of this, or is it really just the other ministries of the? So
that's been the work, like after that initial sort of period of rejection, and then going and starting all these things that sort of existed outside of the Episcopal Church network as it existed currently. Then the bishop said to me, you really need to go back to these churches and tell them what you're doing. And so then I sort of, you know, took myself and picked myself up and said, okay, I'm going to do it. So then I really started going and doing more teaching and back into the parishes, encouraging them. And then it really did. And for me, the example of Flash Compline was I picked 5 parishes in our city, and I said to each of them, I want you to lead. I want you to bring your parishioners out, and we'll bring our praxis communities. We'll do it alongside you, but I want you to do it. So then we started forming partnerships, and our intentional communities, we've tried to work, my understanding of intentional communities, a lot of times I think people think, oh, intentional communities are like the future of the church. And I think, no, that's ridiculous. No one ever, monastic communities were not the future of the church. They're always a very specific group of people who are called to that kind of lifestyle.
Right.
You know.
But it needs to, I mean, as I was teaching the history of the church years and years ago, I realized that that especially in Protestantism, all the eggs got put in the basket of parishes and the leadership, the presbyters or the bishops, and that Christianity is this multiple movement of all kinds of different ways of organizing things. So that I even stopped talking about teaching the history of the church. I started talking about teaching the history of the Christian movements.
Exactly.
When you say church, suddenly you just got this whole hierarchical,
monolithic idea of what it is.
I believe we should have bishops and all of that. Sure, that's all fine. But it's this flotilla of all kinds of different ways of people gathering for worship and community and support and ministry and service. Yeah, absolutely.
And power was always shared. Like bishops had power, but abbots and abbesses had a lot of power too.
Right.
And could actually challenge bishops in their time to see things that the bishop couldn't, and vice versa. The bishop would come and challenge the monastic community to see something. So it feels to me like it's a counterbalance. It's not one over the other. And I do a lot of work for that, for people to say, well, you only care about young adults, or, you know, only care about intentional communities. Like, no, the parish church is what sustains generation after generation. Some of these intentional communities are not going to last more than 15 years. But at the end of the day, they become the catalyst for other things that the church wouldn't do if it weren't for those outside communities.
Exactly.
So in England, they talk about a mixed economy of church. Or some people now are talking about a mixed ecology of church, to use more of a like creation image. But I think there is something in that to say all of this is needed. Like for a healthy church, we need to have many of these different kinds of expressions.
Amen.
I often say to people that the thing about the existing church is that they forget what they got in the business of in the beginning. And so these new intentional communities will come along and say, we just want to live among the poor, and we want to serve people, and we want to share meals together. And that's really all we want to do. And it's fun to go to churches and say, by the way, you got into this for those reasons too. You wanted to serve God's people. You wanted to have fellowship together. You wanted to pray together. That's what these people want to do. And the same time, I go to the intentional communities and I say, those churches that you find so frustrating and stuck in their ways and don't understand and all the systems and hierarchy, they got into this for the same reason you did. And you weren't the first people to invent this idea. And the danger of intentional communities is they can begin to think that they're the only ones who ever came up with this idea. Yeah. And the reality is the church has been doing this for centuries. So I think that's the important counterbalance, right? Is we remind each other of why we're here. And the parishes, the existing church, the established church can teach us, who are starting new expressions, some of the pitfalls and some of the dangers along the way, and can help resource, and not just financially, but, you know, in terms of wisdom being passed on. And the new communities can bring inspiration and new ideas and prophetic voice to the existing church. That's, for me, the real benefit of holding out space for all of these different things. Mm-hmm. In places like Lydia's house, our Catholic worker house, they've done amazing work partnering with local churches who come and are volunteering and are fundraising for them and are bringing meals to share and, you know, bringing Christmas presents for the children in the house. And so I think there really are some beautiful examples of them living alongside each other. But the church knows they don't get to control this organization either. And so that's, I think, an interesting, you know, it's not theirs. They don't own it. They have to really learn how to be humble and be in partnership with another organization.
Yeah. Yeah. That's all great. Could you say a little more about, I mean, you talked about earlier about the people you were involved in toward the beginning, but who are the people, run through the kinds of people that are involved in these intentional communities? Mm-hmm. And you're talking about some ex-evangelicals and ex-charismatics, have many of the unchurched come in. So what's going on with the people?
Yeah. I think we do have some unchurched. I will say, in the beginning, I was like reaching out to people who I knew on the East Coast and on the West Coast who were doing this. And it's very different to be doing this in Ohio. And I think I had to like come to terms with my own context a little bit, that by and large, I don't know a whole lot of totally unchurched people. I know de-churched people who've walked away or been wounded by church. I know a lot of those people. But like completely unchurched people in Ohio, I'm not saying there are none.
Yeah.
And certainly among younger generations, I think we're going to see more and more. But like,
Well, and you're in Southern Ohio too. Yeah.
Yeah, and like I'm in Cincinnati. We're right next to Kentucky.
Right.
Like,
That's the South. Yeah.
We're pretty close to the Bible Belt here. So if they themselves have not regularly gone to church since childhood, their grandparents do, and they've still had to go to Christmas Eve services with their grandparents. So anyway, just to answer the question about the unchurched, and I really wrestled with that. Like, I still come back to like, am I not serving the right group of people? Where are these unchurched people, and how do I connect with them? And maybe I'm too mired in church world to even find unchurched people. I found that the best way to connect with unchurched people is to find people who, and I don't think this will work in every context, but it has worked for me a little bit, is I have found people who are kind of de-churched or who are kind of burned by church. And as we cultivated a relationship, their network of friends and relationships. So there's a young woman who helped us start a missional community. And she was an artist and a musician. She hung out with a lot of musicians. And she did that work, right? Like, I, as an Episcopal priest, was not as well placed to do some of those connections. But my relationship with her and walking alongside her meant that all of a sudden I began to have this sort of sub-network of people who I would go to her shows or would, show up for potluck meals at her house, and began to connect with them. Like, some of the things she did were so amazing. In this neighborhood that she was working in, there was an existing like community dinner. Like, they would have like at someone's house every year for like 15 years. They had like a one night a week, people could just bring a dish and come share dinner together. And so she started hanging out there, and they would have a bonfire out back on some nights, and they would want to sing songs around the bonfire, but no one knew any songs to sing that everyone knew. So she was teaching them like hymns, and they were singing hymns around this bonfire and had just shared this meal together. And, the question is, like, how do you walk with people from being totally unchurched to, like, becoming church? And it's that kind of thing, right? Where you begin to have little experiences of what faith community feels like.
And the right person to start those conversations, right, is often not the priest, right? I mean, as you were saying, it takes the right person to begin those relationships. And as you were saying, it's often we think clergy person goes out and does, I mean, that's often...
Right.
That's typically not going to be the case, right? I mean, it takes someone else to start those conversations.
Right. At least that's what I found. I mean, someone else might tell you something different, but I have found that the best thing I have done has been to empower lay people. And I don't even like the word empower, because it feels like I have power and I'm giving it to them. I don't even think that's really the nature of it. But a sense of being an encourager and a supporter, to say, you have all the gifts you need. You don't need me to help you with this. And, being there to do some theological reflection with them later, to say, how'd it go? What happened? Tell me what's going on this week. Who are you talking to? So, I mean, I think I realized that was my role. And sometimes, I don't know, I would get sad that I wasn't getting to do more of that work, that I was sort of like behind the scenes. But I don't know. It felt like that was it. That I was supposed to help other people be the ones to connect in a way that didn't feel like I was coming in saying, do this.
Is there an intentional way to help lay people identify gifts and nurture them, or you just kind of keep your eyes open, or? In the beginning, I thought a lot more about this, and now I just I think it's more of a gut instinct thing. So it's funny to come back to that question. I think I used to think that there were 3 skill sets, and if I found people with those skill sets, that I would know that they were the ones.
For me, it's someone who can speak theologically without knowing that they're speaking theologically. So who can like notice where God is showing up in situations, and be able to point them out to people, right? Like it seems to me like that's the thing. Like, oh, that's amazing. That's a really like holy moment, or that feeling that you get when you get goosebumps, like something's happening there. What do you think's happening? Like just people who can begin those kinds of conversations. One of my favorite questions is, what is holy for you? And you know, what's the thing that kind of gets under your skin and you can't let it go?
Right.
And helping people cultivate those kinds of conversations. So I think some of what I do is teach people how to ask really good questions and then how to listen. It feels like some of the people that are good at this don't have to like convince other people that they're right. I talk a lot about hosting conversations. So really saying like, I don't have to be in charge of this conversation, but I'm willing to ask the question, hold the space for it, and then let it unfold as it will. And even that's a like learned skill to a certain extent. So I think people who can speak theologically, people who have some capacity to do some like organizing, who can help organize people. So whether that's asset-based community development or just kind of understand the basics of like how you do a one-on-one and that kind of thing. I think, like I said, people who have some sort of evangelical streak in them, I haven't met a lot of them in the Episcopal Church, but if you find them, I think they're great. Otherwise, I think people who are converts to the Episcopal Church tend to be better at this than cradle Episcopalians.
Yep.
So, and I mean, that's a funny thing to tell Episcopalians, but it's just the truth. Like, we're not that great about it, and we haven't taught people how to do it over the years. So maybe we can get better at discipleship and evangelism going forward, but it has not been our native gift.
Yep.
So I think anyone who can do that work, and my experience has been, even if it's just like 3 years in a college campus ministry that had some evangelical component to it, those folks are better at this than the Episcopalians who went to Canterbury Club. So I don't know what that means for us in the future, but
it means we can't continue being the offspring of the established Church of England. That's what it means. I mean, we were an establishment church.
Right. People came to us. We didn't go to them.
That's right. And people
or they were born into it.
People moved up the ladder of institutional preferment to the quality of the Episcopal Church.
Right.
I mean, that's what was happening, especially after the Second World War, when we grew to be 3.6 million people. Those were Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists, a lot of them.
Yeah.
I had a priest who had been born in Westchester County in New York, who was a lifelong Episcopalian from a long Episcopalian family, and he said when he was baptized in the Episcopal Church, you basically had to be born into the Episcopal Church, and there were only 600,000 of us at that point. So you know, that's very deep in Episcopal tradition.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you go to church and the priest reads the service and you give your money and serve on the vestry and organize rummage sales or antique sales, and that's church.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it was better than that, of course, in many places, but the whole ethos is just not geared toward that. Yeah.
Right. Well, in my mind, yeah. I mean, and I think that the thing about it is, as someone who comes from kind of a low church diocese and yet had this conversion experience at Church of the Advent and really understanding the Oxford movement, like there actually is a stream that says we go out among the people and we go to them. That is who we are. And if one of my theology professors in seminary said that for the Episcopal Church, salvation begins at the moment of incarnation, not at the cross. It can be culminated at the cross, but at the moment of incarnation is when we find our salvation.
Uh-huh.
And I think because we're an incarnational people, if we can pull on that stream of our DNA, we can get at this. We know what it means to care about social justice issues. We know what it means to care about art and beauty and music in the world. We know what it means to care about people, but we have to actually practice it. And so for me, that's why I've come back to this praxis communities thing over and over again, because I think orthodoxy has a place in the church. It's never going away. We have beliefs that are core to who we are, but we're not selling the church based on orthodoxy these days. it has to come out of what we do. People have to see us living the thing. Orthodoxy will arise out of orthopraxis, but we have to be I think we're now at a moment in the church's history where our praxis matters more than our orthodoxy.
I agree, absolutely.
So it just is to me like, okay, you don't have to be perfect at it, but you have to do it. So we're having to teach people to do it all over again. Like, okay, go be the church. Go out and talk to people about God. Find out what they think about God. Be part of the conversation. And I've gone to churches, I've sat with mission councils and groups of people who, of course, invite me in and say, help us reach new people. And I ask them my whole standard list of questions like, where do people hang out in your town? And who are the local business owners? And what are the issues that really matter to people in your community? And what keeps people up at night? And they look at me and they say, we don't want to have those conversations with people.
Right.
And I think to myself, okay, that's fine, but you're not going to reach new people if you don't go out and have those kinds of conversations. You're not. They're not coming through your doors on their own.
And I think that one of the problems with the missional emphasis in this diocese so far, but I'm hearing from you, is a much more nuanced, well-rounded whole sense of this thing than at least what the conversation in the diocese is about. I mean, the people who may have been deeply involved in this may have a better feel of it. But what's come across is we go out and find out what people need. And we join them in the work they're already doing. And it's like, no, I mean, there's more to that. I mean, so in one sense, the conversation has been extremely secular in this diocese.
Yeah.
I noticed one of the core tenets of fresh expressions, there's missional, your contextual, your formational, your ecclesial. There's always that road back to what we know as church.
Yeah.
Well, and there's an evangelistic piece
with a priest.
Too.
There is. So one of the things that I love, if you look in the Fresh Expressions UK website, I don't know if it's on the US version of their website, but they have this Fresh Expressions journey. And they say that the journey goes like this. And the whole thing is like prayer and scripture underneath all of it. But they say we begin with building relationships. And then we move to acts of love and service. And then we move to discipleship. Who is Jesus to you? And then we move to creating community, becoming a community. And then we move to making church, starting over again is kind of the way they talk about it. And I think what we do in the Episcopal Church is actually the exact opposite of that. When we planted churches, what we do is we want to make church first, right? So we have tended to stay on the side of, we'll go bring our prayer books and we'll throw them into a room and we'll expect the church to be formed. And then we'll have a community. And then we'll talk about some formation, discipleship work. And then we'll do acts of love and service. We'll go out and outreach. And maybe at the end of it, we'll be in relationship with a new group of people. And I think that method isn't working for us anymore. We actually have to start with real relationships with real people. But we can't lose, to your point, that the point of this is to talk about who Jesus is, right, and to become community in Jesus's name. Like, that's the reason we're doing it. If we're just doing it to be another not-for-profit in the world right, doesn't need more not-for-profits right now. They need people to be like living and walking in the way of Jesus. So we just have to be clear about why we're doing the thing that we're doing. Right. It's not that it's bad to start with building relationships and being of service and loving the people in our neighborhoods. We should do that. That is what the church is about. But it's not about that for the sake of that. It's about that for the sake of Jesus.
Right. And it doesn't mean that we have to proselytize. It does mean that we have to bear witness. And those who will be drawn into a more active relationship with Christian community will be the ones who are drawn. I mean, right, it's not up to us.
That's what I said. Like, I bring my priesthood with me when I show up, right? Like, I can't unpriest myself just because I show up without a collar at a pub. I show up and I am myself. And part of that means that then I end up in a lot of conversations with people who are deeply curious. And I just have to do that with a level of humility and honesty about, you know, where I am with the questions and my thinking through things. So I think the questions are there. The questions have never gone away. Human beings are inherently spiritual beings. So this whole spiritual, not religious thing is ridiculous. Like, that's why we are what we are. And we just have to figure out how to be in those kinds of spaces with people without having to tell them how to behave.
Right.
So in that way, I think Diana Butler Bass's work around this about belonging, starting with the belonging instead of the behavior piece, I think there is some value in that. The learning how to be part of a community should come after the welcoming and openness to another person.
Yeah. But I do think that part of our future is modeling genuine, authentic communities of sharing and support and service.
The world needs that. The world doesn't have that.
As worse and worse in the society, that there's going to be a market, as it were, of people looking for some real community that has meaning and has some practices of civility and sharing and everything. So I like the thing you're talking about what was on the UK website, and I'll go look it up about this and then this and then this and then this, and I agree with you that we reversed it in the Episcopal Church, yeah, and in most mainstream churches.
And in most mainstream churches, exactly. We're no different. In fact, I don't know if Stephanie shared this, but part of my work, so I've been sharing with you about my work in the Diocese of Southern Ohio, but I'm also serving right now as chair of the advisory group on church planting and missional initiatives for the Episcopal Church. So last General Convention, the General Convention approved $5 million for church planting and new missional initiatives. So we've overseen that granting process, including developing the criteria and the grant and reading like 150 or so grants around the church projects people are working on. And then we've also been working on building infrastructure. We're the only mainline church who, up until this triennium, has had no infrastructure for this. We've had no coaches, we've had no assessments, we've had no trainings. Most of the people who've planted churches for us around the country have gone to evangelical church planter boot camps and then tried to translate back into the Episcopal Church, which is not an easy task. It's not impossible, and they probably gained something from the experience, but planting in an established church is very different than planting in an evangelical church. We have to be accountable to our bishops and diocesan councils and other churches in a different kind of way. So it seems to me that that's actually one of the things that, not only do we not know how to do this on a like person-to-person basis, but institutionally we've had no resources for this. And we've had no one thinking about it. The Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, they've all been thinking about this for like 20 to 30 years, if not longer. And we literally have had no infrastructure for church planting within the Episcopal Church, which is kind of shocking when you think about it. And when I say church planting, I don't just mean we're going to build a building and expect people to come. I mean, anything from, meeting people on a street corner to house churches to coffee shop churches to anything. But
that's because we were the Apple computer of the religious world before Apple had a marketing plan. We were the quality product and the good
exactly.
Right.
We already had everything we needed to be the church. We didn't need to make new ones. And yet we look back at like that church growth movement of the 50s and 60s, which I agree with you was kind of an anomaly. It was not really our identity. But a big piece of that is that we were actually willing to go to new neighborhoods, and we were doing it all geographically, which I don't think will work anymore in a world that's networked. It's not just about geography, but we were willing to do it, and then we stopped being willing to do it, and then we saw that like it actually, you have to be willing to go where the people are in whatever context and place that is.
Right. Well, and that's, in terms of bringing people into this, that's one of the things that can be cited. I mean, kind of, we've done this before, but in a different form, and times have changed, and we need to do it in a different way.
Right. And that's always one of the challenges. It's one of the things I find deeply challenging about my work is, am I doing this to try to save the church from itself? Or are we doing this because this is God's call to us, right? And most of the time we're giving the argument to people in the church that we're doing this to help them survive, when really we probably need to not be doing it for that reason, because God's not in this for us to be afraid of death. God's in this because God believes that we need the church, as you said, Bob, to be authentic Christian community in our own time. That this is the way in which we experience the presence of God, the presence of Jesus in our midst.
Yeah, but I don't think it's either or. I mean, as we know, the institution is being shaken, and it's going to shake down, and all kind of parishes. We're closing parish. We've got all kinds of parishes can't have full-time priests, and some of them are going to close and all this. So, I mean, those that survive will be the church institution, the parishes, and they're a crucial part of the picture that you're drawing of why the parish church is important, and that's all important. So it's not either or. So we're not doing it just to save the church as it is, certainly not. But bolstering the institution and helping the institution get a new angle of vision on things is a crucial part of this.
Right.
And I think in selling it to parishes,
people.
Sometimes I've heard rhetoric that says, we don't know where we're going and we've got to change what we're doing. And it's like, that scares people because it's like, we're going to lose everything we know. And that's not true. I mean, we're not going to lose the Eucharist. We're not going to lose the scriptures.
Right.
We're not going to lose all the organs in every diocese, we're not going to lose all the choirs, but new occasions teach new duties.
Right. Yep. I think you're right. It's always a both and knowing who you're talking to when you're kind of trying to convince people of why this might matter. I mean, I've had lots of conversations with grandmothers who say, my grandkids don't want to come to the Episcopal Church. If they go to church at all, it's to a totally different tradition and isn't this. And so I say, that's why I'm doing this, because I believe that your grandchildren matter and God loves your grandchildren as much as they love you, as much as God loves you. And so, and I think there is a way to say to people, this matters and you can care about this too. So.
Yeah.
Anthony, how is this striking you?
I mean, I feel a bunch of different things. I think that, there's in one sense, there's a massive amount of reimagining to do. And I think along the lines of, if it's clergy, let's just say, there's a lot of, you can control that a little easier, with training and so forth. But when it comes to some of the patterns that we've been, that are set with the laity and so forth, then you're talking about empowering people or encouraging people, then there's a daunting side to it that I'm feeling, but necessary and important. And I think it's the fact that our diocese is having these conversations late, it sounds like, but still having them. Maybe not late.
We're all late to this game.
Maybe not late for Episcopal standards from what you're saying, but nonetheless. So I mean, I think that, it's daunting in some ways when we start really talking about it as far as, reimagining and moving the mindset in a different direction. But I also think there's something liberating about this idea of experimentation and mixed results and loose affiliations. And the starting point depends a lot on context, but the experimenting itself is, I think, a good and healthy thing. And maybe we've committed too much to one model, and that is unhealthy in really in almost any system.
Right.
Yeah, and at least not in a system that's been so closed in the way in which it's done it, right? We almost need a period of throwing it all up and saying, so what could we do? And giving people space to try that on. I'm not sure that you can hold that kind of space forever. I don't think it's an indefinite space.
Yeah.
But it feels like a necessary space in between the way things have been and the space we want to move into. Right. It feels to me like when I began, if I had said, like I did say, here's the plan didn't work. I needed space. I kept talking to my bishop about having a sandbox of my own, right? Where I could build something, knock it down, build something else and see. And so I think to understand that there's value in that there's value in that period of experimentation to figure out what will work in your context and with the people that you are in relationship with.
Right.
Great.
Are there any established parishes in your diocese that you know of that essentially recreated themselves, reinvented themselves?
Yeah, there actually is one, and it's still a process as these things go, but there's a church called St. Matthew's, which was in a neighborhood north of Columbus called Westerville, and they were a big church plant, and they went through, as many of our churches, well, it was actually the only one in Southern Ohio, but many Episcopal churches did, a split post Gene Robinson. And the priest at that time took part of the congregation with them. And they were left with this massive building that they had built and very little resources to sustain it. And the diocese was pouring lots of money every year into trying to get them back on their feet. And they ended up, I mean, it was a couple of years of a process of this, trying to figure out what to do. But they've ended up leaving their building. They sold their building. And they've moved into downtown Westerville, and they were kind of sharing space with another church for a season of this process. But they now worship on the third floor of a pub on Sunday mornings. It's all red brick walls, and they transform it into an Episcopal liturgical space. It's kind of like a banquet room of this third floor of a pub downtown. And they bought a house right in the business district, and they have a variety of, weekday prayer services and book groups and other neighborhood organizations who use the house. And then they do a lot of street church stuff too. They go out on, Ash Wednesday and on Good Friday and various times and have worship services. Hold on one second. I have a little person wanting my attention.
Yeah, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
But so they really have gone through this whole process of kind of learning how to, see the front porch of their house as the narthex of the church, and how to see the pub as their place of having communion together and being in communion with their neighborhood. So, I mean, that they've been working at this, and we have other churches who've done, smaller experiments like, doing their pancake supper at the IHOP or something like that, where they just go out into the community and are kind of more present in that kind of way. But yeah, so I mean, I think, 5 years ago, I never would have thought people would come to me and say things like, do you think we could do house churches at our church? That was just not language that Episcopalians used. And for me to be able to say, yeah, you could get a group of people together and they could be praying together and meeting for a meal once a week. And that's something you could do.
Without the benefit of clergy.
Without the benefit of clergy. Yeah.
Okay.
And in many cases, I think that's part of the practice too. I think there are lots and lots of blessings of the 1979 prayer book, but one of them, which I think said Eucharist is the principal act of the gathered people, actually caused us to try to be a kind of church that actually in our DNA we weren't. Saying the daily office was part of what made us Episcopal, and you didn't need clergy to say that daily office. And I think there's something to that. I think we're going to have to return to a period of time where we see people praying the daily office as central to who the church is, and not rooted in we have to have a priest in order to be the church.
Okay.
I don't see a way
done,
forward otherwise.
What it's done, even though it's historically and sacramentally correct, is to up the whole issue of the priesthood, and to make priests more necessary than ever. And I'm rather high church in my theology, but I think that we need to really honor different kinds of assemblies of worship that are not necessarily Eucharistic, and think of different ways how the Eucharist can fit into the overall life of this network of groups that you're talking about. And part of the modeling of this, I think, could even come from the early Methodist movement in England. And because, Wesley was telling his people to troop off to the parish church and go to communion in the early days. But the Methodist meetings, the Methodist classes were not Eucharistic, even though he was very Eucharistically centered. I mean, he spawned this movement that was really about the kind of, in its own time and place, the kind of thing we're talking about here.
It's so funny you say that, because I've often talked to my Methodist friends about whether there would be a Methodist church if the Church of England had been able to accept these fresh expressions in that time. And in some ways, I think, yeah, like this is it. This is our Wesley moment, right? Are we going to see people, you know, sharing meals around the dinner table in their house as anti-Anglican, or are we going to say, no, there's space for that. You can do that. That's part of who we are.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think as clergy, I mean, you had just, Bob had just said, you know, Wesley's preference, or, you know, maybe the height of his spiritual experience was the Eucharist. And we may feel that way as clergy, but that doesn't, I mean, do we want to then mold the entire pattern of the church around that preference or that experience?
Right.
In a very changing, in a changed environment and a different time.
We had, before Bob got on, I'd asked about, we talked about Ken and Rob Rhodes. I don't know if you know him, Bob. He was a priest in the Diocese of Newark. But
No, I don't know.
he was not successful in getting a daily office movement going, as far as I can tell, at the cathedral. I mean, do you have a sense why?
Well, my 2 cents on this is that Rob's piety and the cathedral's piety are two very different things. And I think it's always hard to enforce your own personal piety on a congregation that it's not in their DNA.
But this is important, though. You know, I mean, this is what
it is important. It absolutely is. And in fact, prior to Rob getting there was a group of people who were praying morning prayer every week. Every day during the week. And one of the things that kind of happened at the cathedral is that the clergy tried to take over that, and then the clergy would get busy and not show up for the services. So the people who had been doing it on their own were sort of disempowered from that. And I only say that because my dad is one of the people, like I said, I grew up in the church. And my dad used to go to morning prayer every day for a long time. He worked downtown and it was convenient. And it kind of became a thing that when the clergy didn't show up, it didn't happen. And so I think that they kind of lost their core group of people who were committed to it. And I think Rob came in after that. And it was
a bad taste in the mouth, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not so much concerned about quote unquote daily office practice as I am about encouraging groups of lay people to go ahead and worship.
Yeah,
exactly.
And the prayer book provides at least a jumping off point for them to do that. So, and part of where I'm coming from is having been involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship when I was in college. And here's this, the fundamentally lay network of college ministries. We certainly didn't need any priests to help us pray. And a lot of us became Episcopalians in the 60s and 70s. But, if you have, the people who are feeding the poor, and then they can say Compline together, or the people who are gathering for meals, they can say evening prayer together.
Yeah. One of the intentional
that's what I'm interested in, is in encouraging them, beginning with the prayer book.
Yeah.
Just pray together.
Yep. One of the intentional communities that we worked with, and this was not, again, my creation at all, this was totally them. They were living in Columbus in an inner city neighborhood, very Shane Claiborne-esque, like moving in to try to work with the people who were poor there. And they would gather each week on Thursdays for a potluck meal. And one of their spiritual practices that they developed was a kind of Ignatian examen. They called it the examen. And they would go around and they would ask each other, what is breaking your heart right now? And what is giving you joy? Mm-hmm. And they would share out of the kind of depths of the heartbreak of living in this very impoverished neighborhood with problems that were insolvable by 20-somethings trying to do good. What was really hard to hear the mom shouting and the shotgun, shots being fired into the neighbor's house the night before, like that, to be able to bring that to God and each other. And they wrote their own prayer book where they wrote their own prayers that they would pray and found prayers that were really meaningful to them, and they shared them together. So I just think it's a process, right? Like a lot of times we can't just give people this Book of Common Prayer and be like, everything you need is here. But we also have to kind of open source it. We have to say, take what you like from this and use it. And then people are going to find, well, actually, there is no more beautiful prayer in the world than Compline. And they fall in love with it in their own way without us sort of saying, you that are already gathering should use this. I think there's a way to kind of offer it with a spirit of like, there's some really beautiful prayers here. I wanted you to see some of that.
And that's why I say using the prayer book as a jumping off point. Yeah, not a limit, but an inspiration. You could do something like this. What would you like to do?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a lot of how I apprentice people, was sort of saying, let me help you plan the service. Let me show you what resources I have. Tell me what things you love, and let's plan it together. And at the end of that, you have people who are actually really gifted at planning liturgy. I think a lot of our lay people don't know how to plan liturgy because no one's ever shown them the tools and the resources and the process through which it's created. Yeah. I've been sharing this with a lot of people. There's a really amazing article by Philip Clayton called Theology After Google. Have any of you seen that article?
No.
It's a few years old. Have you seen it?
I have not.
Oh, so he writes in this article about the Reformation and how at the time people said, you know, average people shouldn't read the Bible. Like, it should be to a certain class of people who can read the Bible and interpret it to other people. People will misuse the Bible if they have it in their own hands. And of course, people were right. The Bible has been misused in so many ways over the years. But without the Reformation, we never would have had the civil rights movement in quite the same way, right? We never would have had many of the social movements when people had scripture in their own hands and could read it for themselves. And he argues that the same thing is now happening with theology, that in an age of Google and blogs and pub theologies, that people are doing theology on their own without the permission of an authority, a theological authority. And that's why you find groups out there, you know, reading great theologians and talking about them without any clergy around.
Right.
And so he argues this is happening, and he has this little part at the end of the article where he also says, he sort of points to the fact that this is beginning to happen with liturgy as well. So you have people doing memorial services, you know, at the beach and getting licensed to marry their best friends, and, you know, processing tragic events, you know, around the dinner table with their friends in their own houses. And so he says that the role of clergy in the future, and I would argue any Christian leader, I don't actually think it has to be clergy, but the role is to be hosts of these things. So the question is, how as clergy, as trained theologians, do we come into those kinds of conversations and help host the conversation without thinking that we own the conversation and knowing all of the right answers?
Yep.
How do we do that with liturgy? How do we host liturgical kinds of conversations and experiences without thinking that we need to own the experience?
Yep.
And I found it really profound. Like, it's not anything I was taught in seminary. Like, in seminary, I was taught, you go in and you say, I am by canon licensed to tell you how to do this liturgy. But I've done marriage counseling with like now so many young adults and so many couples. I found that those conversations lead me deeper into the liturgy than I would have been otherwise. And the kinds of reflection that I'm doing with couples preparing for marriage or preparing for a funeral or any of it is very different from the way that I was taught to do it. And not necessarily unorthodox, just it's a different entry point into those kinds of conversation.
Uh-huh. Yep.
If you were advising someone discerning a call to ordained ministry, what kind of advice would you give these days? That's part of our mandate, is to think about what kind of leaders are needed and how are they formed for whatever church is being born.
Yeah. So it's funny, I was on our COM for 6 years. I went on sabbatical earlier this year and stepped down after 6 years on the COM. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Our bishop has written extensively about it. So he actually has sort of 3 characteristics that he thinks the church needs right now. And he argues that the church needs theologians, similar to what I said earlier, not necessarily people who are expert theologians, but who can host conversations about God. People notice when holy things are happening. Entrepreneurs, and what he's calling faith community organizers. We started with just community organizers, but he's talking about faith community organizers, people who can help organize other people to achieve their goals. and entrepreneurs, clearly not just the business model, but people who are willing to risk things and fail, people who are willing to try on new things. And so I think there's something to that. I think the kinds of people we're raising up, I think, have some of those qualities. I've warned our bishop. I said, I'm just telling you, if you recruit entrepreneurs, this is what's going to happen. It's going to be really messy. They're not going to follow all the rules. Entrepreneurs go the quickest possible route to get someplace. Don't expect them to follow, your path. So I said, just be prepared that that's what will happen. But I think that the church does need entrepreneurial clergy in the future. I think we need people who are willing to be circuit riders again, who are willing to go out and meet people, not just have one clergy, one priest, who are willing to bring their skills to multiple communities. Or who maybe, are bivocational, who have a call to one area and can use that skill. I think it is hard to be a bivocational clergy, like running a business and being a clergy person. I think if you're a certain kinds of vocations, if you are, say, a college professor and want to be a priest and can find a way to do both things, I think it might be slightly easier. But I think more important than like people having two jobs, I think it is more that like clergy are going to have to be willing to not just sit at, in the church and wait for people to come to them. I think the future of being a clergy person means really being willing to get out on the front lines and be with people where they are. Like I said, I feel like most of my work as a missioner has been not so much in creating the communities that I long for, but helping other people create the communities they long for. And so that has felt like, it's just this sort of spiritual discipline in and of itself, to kind of put my own needs aside. And I think when I look at some clergy colleagues, I think I find them looking for the spiritual communities they long for more than the spiritual communities than the people that they know long for. So I would say that has to be a kind of key quality.
Is the diocese doing anything, assuming the seminaries are just going to do a fraction of the work on these 3 points? Is there other opportunity to give the
Yeah, we're thinking about that. We've had a residency model. I don't know how you all do it post-seminary, but we've had a residency model where people come back for 2 to 3 years post-seminary and are sort of assigned either a curacy. When I came out of seminary, we were actually being assigned to small congregations and then we would have a mentor priest that worked with us. So I was kind of on my own in my first congregation for the most part. Our current bishop is not a fan of that model, but we're looking at exploring it again, because I think one of our hopes is that we might be able, because of some financial resources we have in the diocese, to help pay for those residency experiences. What we're thinking is, can we help pay for someone to be working part-time in a smaller congregation, but then part-time doing some missional initiative work, sort of starting new things? And if there was appropriate coaching and mentorship, could we help support them through that experience? I think it depends on the person and depends on the skill set and a lot of those kinds of things, the community. So I don't think it's like a formula necessarily, but I like the idea that people would be, from the very beginning, encouraged to be doing some traditional pastoral work and some missional out in the community work, and that would be not just like on the side for fun because you enjoy it, but like the diocese is saying, we expect this of you. We expect you to start something from scratch, kind of thing. And we'll support you, we'll give you a coach, we'll help you come up with a plan, but that's part of your assignment essentially in this season of your life. And the bishop does feel strongly that the residency curacy time period is still part of the formation. So
after ordination.
Post ordination, yeah.
Close to.
No, after, yeah. To your point, post, yeah.
Yeah. No, and I think, Larry, that we can't expect the seminaries to do this, and maybe it isn't their job. I mean, I know that the CDSP is trying to turn itself in a different direction. I know the dean, and he and I have talked extensively. But it's the whole issue of continuing training in the diocese. We can't just come out of seminary expecting we're finished. And as Anthony's already said, there's going to have to be a change, at least in part, of of the cadre of priests and a change in the priestly culture. I mean, we've been lone rangers. We've been out in our own parish. We've been, following the canons in the prayer book mostly, but, we haven't been very cooperative with one another. It's got to change. And I really love your articulation of this model of relational networks and accountability, a different kind of accountability. I think that's, and then it includes the parishes. The parishes become part of this. That aligns very much and articulates much better than I've been able to the way I see that we need to move.
Mm-hmm. I would also argue one thing that could be done is really giving people skills in community organizing. Like, I loved my experience in CPE and have found it immensely helpful in listening skills. But if what we're really teaching people to do is be able to listen deeply to another human being and respond to the needs at hand, whatever that might be, I would argue that community organizing could be an equivalent kind of CPE type of experience. And it could be interesting to help people gain some of those skills prior to entering parish ministry.
Or lay people.
Or lay people, yeah. I mean, I think it could be done.
No, it's about leadership, it seems to me.
Right.
It's about who's going to be leaders. And again, we've got to recover a much more vivid sense of a more early church sort of thing, that those of us who are theologically educated and ordained to preside at the Lord's Supper are all it's just one ministry in the middle of a lot of ministries. There are lots of very different leadership roles that have to be there.
That being said, I'm pretty anti-licensing people, because I think when we license people, I think we tend to cut them off at the knees. We've basically said, you can't do this thing unless we give you the license. And so I think it's just one way that we've tried to control people. So I just think that outside of like the orders for ministry, I'm not so sure that licensing evangelists and licensing catechists and licensing lay Eucharistic visitors is really all that helpful. But that might just be my own issue. But
our bishop turns his eyes on that.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm just not sure that we're actually getting what we want. Like, I think we can train people for it, but telling them you can't be a lay reader without being licensed is probably a little absurd. Like,
it's too bureaucratic. It's too tough. It doesn't suit our needs at this point.
And most of it means that as someone on a diocesan staff, you're just employing a diocesan staff, because your staff is the one who has to actually do all the work of licensing people. I'm just not sure it's like really that important. Like, I think it can be done at the local level without needing to be done at the administrative level.
Right. Well, that was all part of the pyramidal development of church organization in the Episcopal Church and other churches, especially after the Second World War, but in the 20th century. Yeah. And that was not always the
difference between training people and licensing them. I guess that would be my argument.
Right, yeah.
Audrey, give ourselves 5 more minutes. Is that fair? Yeah, I know your daughters.
Yeah, I've got 5 more. I'll have to leave in about 5 minutes.
Okay. I mean, I just want to...
My daughter wants hot chocolate. She'll survive.
Yeah, okay. Any last minute questions? Anthony, you look like you're...
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking too, Larry, about your question about leadership and formation. I mean, I think there's something that seminaries can do maybe better, and I think this is part of the larger conversation, is taking our ascetical theology and spiritual practices that apply to the individual, but also teaching them in the context of parish ministry or in ordained ministry, meaning, like, I think there's a really intimate connection between something like kenosis and not going into a parish and throwing your own desires and wants on a parish. I mean,
yes.
Otherwise, I think what happens, and I mean, Father, I served I served at 2 parishes, one with Larry and one with Father Morris, is that, I mean, so I think what happens is that you made the mistake that, like I made, you go to a place and you think this is all wrong, and you do it your way, and then you learn from experience, like, oh, that was arrogant and stupid. And so maybe we can find a way to prevent that from happening, and to have that at the seminary level, and make that connection between something like kenosis and, you shouldn't be going in there and shoving your own preferences on everyone else. I mean, who is this really about?
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's exactly kind of what I was pointing to before, which is the idea that we take our belief systems and we figure out, how does this actually go into practice? How is it not just something we assent to as a theological concept, but something we actually practice? What does it mean to practice kenosis, to pour out oneself on behalf of the body of Christ? Like, that is actually a much harder thing to do than it is to think about. And so, yeah, I would love to see us teaching that. And I would love to see us teach people how to teach people how to do that too, right? Like, I think there's something about saying, like, how do we teach people prayer practices? Not just our own, but like a whole variety of prayer practices so that we're equipped to do that. One of the things I loved about getting to learn from the people in the Church of England is they have such a different way of being church than we do, where we sort of have these camps, like, oh, the high church and the low church people are here, and we don't like the other people or something. And they have this lovely, like, Catholic and evangelical streams in the Church of England where they teach each other how to do the thing that the other person is called to. So if you are coming out of an evangelical stream of the Church of England, you have to go learn from the Catholics how to do all the other pieces. So you were trained when you come out of seminary with that. And the same is vice versa. The people who are Catholic have to go learn the evangelical path a little bit. So they just have a deep respect for each other and an acknowledgement that they're all working on behalf of the church and that it's all important. And I just don't think we can fight with each other anymore. We're not at a point in our own history where it's serving us to say my way or the highway. Like, we honestly have to say, if you are leading people to Christ and serving Christ in your community, bless you. Like, thank you for that work. That is amazing, beautiful work. And that someone else could say that about the person who's doing it in a totally different way than them. That's my dream for our church. And I hope that there is a way that we can come to, like, love and respect each other. Because I think we do need multiple paths. Like, it's not going to work for us to say one path anymore. So, yeah. But I love that idea of the seminaries helping people learn how to do that. I think there is real, like, I think that's good. That could work.
Well, I found this both inspiring and encouraging. You've really given voice to a lot of stuff I've been thinking. And again, as I said earlier, the experience that you've had doing this, what you've learned doing it, your kind of multifaceted take on it is really refreshing and encouraging to hear. So I thank you very, very much and applaud the work that you're doing.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a joy to talk with you. And it's always fun to reflect on the journey that you've been on in ministry and think back on, like, oh, what was I thinking back then? Someone had interviewed me for their thesis from our diocese, their doctoral thesis, like a year and a half into my ministry. And I recently read it and I thought, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I can't believe I said that. I thought I knew everything. But yeah, it is a great joy to be able to share with you. And if there's anything I can do to help, please let me know.
Well, yes, thank you. Likewise, it was encouraging and inspiring. So
yeah, I want to bring her to the diocese and never tell her story.
I was at Missional Voices a year ago, so you can watch my video.
And what she says would go a long way to helping people understand what this is all about. I really do. You've done the most appealing presentation of this that I've heard, and I'm very encouraged by it.
Thank you, Rob.
Well, Jane, thank you. And you've got a daughter, hot chocolate, right? That's on order?
Something like that.
All right.
Probably dinner first.
Thank you. God bless.
All right, take care. See you all soon. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Thanks, Brian.
So we want to reflect and then, meet again just to think about
Sure.
what we're going to do with what we heard.
Sure.
Yeah. And
We'll do it next week.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. We'll email. I'll email it between the two of us, and I'll send the recording around if you want to review it. But
Yeah. Okay. I've taken some notes.
Yeah.
But it would be good to have the recording.
Yeah. But just that
great.
relational network, I thought that's what struck me. Just that we're all, it's not the hierarchy of church, CDC, but somehow it's of a piece that.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, and that can fit. I mean, that can fit in our reorganization. I mean, I know some models from other denominations about that, and the ways executive presbyters have changed their relationship to the. Anyway, we can talk.
Yeah, exactly. All right, gentlemen, I will end the meeting.
Have a good Thanksgiving, both of you.
Thanks.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.